Guinea, late 1942. The air at the Port Moresby airfield was thick enough to chew, a suffocating mix of humidity, aviation fuel, and the rotting smell of the jungle. Lieutenant Frank Miller stood on the pierced steel planking, looking up at his machine. It was a P-38 Lightning. To a pilot raised on single-engine trainers, it looked like something from a science fiction magazine. It was massive. Two twin booms stretched back like a catamaran, housing two distinct rudders. In the center pod sat the cockpit, perched high above the wings, and a nose packed with four 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. The Japanese called it two airplanes with one pilot. The Germans called it the forked-tailed devil. But to Frank and the boys of the 39th Fighter Squadron, it was just a heavy, complicated beast that was getting them killed. "She's a fast ship, Lieutenant," the crew chief said, wiping grease from his hands. "Just don't try to dance with her." Frank nodded, climbed the ladder, and strapped in. The twin Allison V-12 engines roared to life, spitting blue flame. The ground shook. This wasn't a plane, it was a locomotive with wings. They scrambled at 0800 hours. Radar had picked up a flight of bogies coming over the Owen Stanley Range. At 20,000 feet, the air was crisp. Frank felt invincible. The P-38 cruised like a Cadillac. It was stable, powerful, and fast. But then he saw them. Below, against the dark green canopy of the jungle were the specks. They were Mitsubishi A6M0s. They were painted a pale, ghostly gray. "Tally-ho! Bandits at 4 o'clock low!" Frank rolled his heavy fighter over and dove. The wind screamed over the canopy. The airspeed indicator wound up past 350 miles per hour. This was the P-38's game, the boom and zoom. He lined up a zero in his sights. The enemy plane looked fragile, almost like a paper kite constructed of balsa wood and rice paper. Frank squeezed the trigger. The nose of his Lightning erupted in smoke. The concentrated fire shredded the air where the zero had been a split second ago. But the zero wasn't there. In a move that seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics, the Japanese pilot had banked hard to the left. It wasn't a turn, it was a pirouette. The zero, weighing less than half of the P-38, could turn on a dime. Frank made a fatal mistake. He tried to follow. He hauled back on the yoke, trying to force 15,000 pounds of American aluminum to match the turn of a 5,000-pound Japanese featherweight. The P-38 shuddered. The G-forces slammed Frank into his seat, draining the blood from his head. The plane groaned, bleeding speed, struggling to keep its nose up. He looked over his shoulder. The paper kite had completed a full circle and was now sitting directly on his tail. "Brake left! Brake left!" his wingman screamed over the radio. But it was too late. The Zero's 7.7mm machine gun sparked across Frank's left engine boom. He heard the terrifying thwack, thwack, thwack of bullets hitting metal. Smoke began to trail from his port engine. The P-38 was a brick in a dogfight. Frank was fighting the controls, sweat pouring into his eyes. He was flying the most advanced fighter in the world, and he was being embarrassed by a plane that didn't even have self-sealing fuel tanks. "Dive, damn it, dive!" Frank slammed the throttles forward and pushed the nose down. This was the only card he had left: gravity. The heavy P-38 dropped like a stone. The engine screamed as he pushed past 400 miles per hour. The jungle floor rushed up to meet him. He looked back. The zero was shrinking. The Japanese plane couldn't follow the dive. Its light airframe would rip apart at those speeds. The paper kite had to float. The devil could fall. Frank leveled out at treetop height, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had survived, but only by running away. Back at the base, Frank climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked. He looked at the bullet holes in the tail boom. He kicked the tire in frustration. "We can't turn with them," he told the intelligence officer, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You try to turn with a zero, you're dead. It's like fighting a ghost. You punch at it and it's gone, and then it's stabbing you in the back." The P-38 was faster, climbed better, and hit harder. But on that day in 1942, the pilots hadn't figured out the puzzle. They were trying to box a shadow. They didn't know yet that the solution wasn't in the manual and it wasn't in the cockpit. It was hidden inside the engines, waiting for a mechanic with a piece of wire to unlock the monster within.
November 1942. The Solomon Sea, 25,000 feet. Captain Thomas "Red" Reynolds was the hunter. He sat high in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, the screaming banshee, looking down at the world through a layer of frost on his canopy. The twin engines were humming a deep, synchronized thrum that vibrated through his bones. Up here in the thin, cold air, the P-38 was king. Below him, a flight of 3 Japanese Zeros was cruising north. To Reynolds, they looked like insects, slow, fragile, unaware. "Tally-ho," Reynolds whispered into his mask, dropping in. He pushed the yoke forward. The nose of the massive twin-boom fighter dipped. Gravity and 2,000 horsepower combined to turn the P-38 into a falling anvil. The airspeed indicator began its clockwise dance. 300 miles per hour, 350 miles per hour, 400 miles per hour. The lead Zero pilot saw him. Instead of turning, which would have been suicide against a diving P-38, the Japanese pilot did the only thing he could do. He rolled inverted and pulled into a vertical power dive. Reynolds grinned. "You can't outrun gravity, pal," he muttered. The P-38 was heavier. It fell faster. Reynolds followed the Zero down, intent on closing the distance for a kill. The speed climbed past 450 miles per hour. The wind noise outside shifted from a roar to a high-pitched shriek. And then the devil woke up. It started with a vibration in the yoke, not a mechanical rattle, but a deep, harmonic buffeting that felt like the plane was driving over railroad ties. Reynolds ignored it. He was closing in. 500 yards, 400 yards. He reached for the trigger on the control column, but the nose of the P-38 suddenly tucked under. It pitched down violently, steepening the dive on its own. Reynolds frowned and pulled back on the stick to bring the nose up and line up the shot. The stick didn't move. It wasn't jammed. It felt like it was set in concrete. He pulled harder. Nothing. The plane was now diving at a nearly 70-degree angle, screaming toward the ocean at 520 miles per hour. Compressibility. The engineers back at Lockheed had a name for it. Reynolds just called it the coffin corner. As the P-38 approached the speed of sound, Mach 1, the air over the thick wings accelerated faster than the plane itself. Shock waves, invisible but as hard as iron, formed on the upper surface of the wings. These shock waves destroyed the lift and created a turbulent wake that smashed into the tail. The horizontal stabilizer, the control surface that allowed the plane to pull up, was effectively flying in a vacuum. Reynolds had no elevator. He was a passenger in a 5-ton bullet. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. The ocean was rushing up. The blue water filled the entire windscreen. The Zero he had been chasing had already pulled out, leveling off at 10,000 feet. The Japanese pilot watched as the American monster screamed past him, out of control. Reynolds planted his boots against the instrument panel. He grabbed the yoke with both hands, his knuckles white, his biceps screaming. He pulled with everything he had. He pulled until he thought he would snap the control column in half. The P-38 ignored him. The buffeting was so violent now that the dials on the dashboard were unreadable. The plane was shaking itself apart. 15,000 feet. 10,000 feet. Pull up, you bastard," Reynolds screamed. He reached for the trim tab wheel, a desperate last-ditch move. He spun it back, trying to force the nose up mechanically. Nothing. 5,000 feet. The whitecaps on the waves were visible now. This was it. This was how he died, not by a bullet, but by physics. Then a miracle of thermodynamics happened. As the P-38 plunged into the lower atmosphere, the air got thicker, denser, and importantly, warmer. In warmer air, the speed of sound is higher. As the temperature rose, the Mach number dropped. The shock waves on the wings began to slide backward. The turbulence hitting the tail smoothed out. At 3,000 feet, just seconds from impact, the concrete in the stick suddenly turned back into fluid. The elevator bit into the air. Because Reynolds was still pulling back with all his strength, the sudden return of control was violent. The P-38 groaned under 7 Gs of force as the nose snapped up. Reynolds' vision went black as the blood drained from his brain. The wings flexed, rivets popping like gunshots, but they held. He leveled out at 800 feet above the water, skimming the waves, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were shaking so badly he couldn't unclench them from the stick. He had survived the trap, but as he turned for home, terrified and exhausted, he knew the truth. The P-38 was faster than the Zero, but it had a speed limit. And if you crossed that line, the fork-tailed devil would try to kill you itself.
New Guinea, 1943. The heat in the maintenance revetment was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the steel skin of the P-38 Lightning too hot to touch. Master Sergeant Thomas Mac McIntyre wiped the sweat from his eyes with a grease-stained rag. In front of him sat the sad sack, a P-38 that had just limped home with 50 bullet holes in its tail. On the workbench lay the enemy, not a Japanese Zero, but a book, the Lockheed P-38 Maintenance Manual. "It says right here, Sarge," the young corporal said, tapping the page, "under no circumstances should the wastegate regulator be adjusted to exceed 44 inches of manifold pressure. If we bypass the regulator, the engine could blow." Mac looked at the corporal, then at the pilots sitting by the jeep, smoking nervously. They were losing. The Japanese Zeros were lighter, slower, and made of wood and canvas, but they could climb like helium balloons. The P-38s, heavy beasts of war, had the power, but the factory settings were strangling them. The Allison V1710 engines had massive turbo-superchargers. They were designed to suck in thin air at 30,000 feet and compress it to give the engine breath. But to protect the engines from exploding, the engineers at Lockheed and General Electric had installed a wastegate regulator. It was a safety valve. When the pilot shoved the throttle forward, the regulator would panic and dump the excess pressure out the back, limiting the power to a safe level. "Safe," Mac muttered. "Safe is what gets my boys killed." He had seen it yesterday. A P-38 trying to climb away from a Zero. The pilot had slammed the throttle, needing instant power, but the regulator had done its job. It opened the wastegate, bleeding off the boost. The P-38 climbed sluggishly, like a truck going uphill. The Zero had caught it in 10 seconds. Mac picked up a pair of pliers and a spool of safety wire. "What are you doing, Sarge?" the corporal asked, eyes wide. "I'm rewriting the book." He climbed up onto the wing, popping the cowling off the No. 1 engine. There it was, the hydraulic regulator arm, the leash that held the beast back. Mac took a length of heavy-gauge steel wire. He didn't use a micrometer. He didn't use a slide rule. He used his gut. He wrapped the wire around the wastegate linkage and twisted it tight, effectively locking the gate partially closed. He was bypassing the safety system. He was tricking the engine into thinking it was always starving for air. "Sarge, if the pilot pushes it past 60 inches, the cylinder heads will fly through the cowling," the corporal warned. "And tell him not to push it past 60 unless they're dead otherwise," Mac grunted. "Better to blow an engine than take a 20mm shell in the cockpit." Lieutenant Vance, the pilot of the SADSAC, walked over. He looked at the wire, then at Mac. "What's that, Chief?" "That," Mac said, wiping his hands, "is your life insurance, Lieutenant. The manual says you get 1,100 horsepower. That wire says you get 1,600. Vance looked at the crude modification, a 10-cent piece of wire holding back the fury of a V12 engine. "Is it legal?" Vance asked. "It's a court-martial if we get caught on the ground," Mac said, looking Vance in the eye. "But up there, it's the difference between being a target and being a rocket." The next morning, the squadron scrambled. Vance was at 15,000 feet when 3 Zeros dropped from the sun. He did what he always did. He turned to run. But then he remembered the wire. He slammed the throttles forward. Usually the plane would groan and slowly build speed. Not today. The manifold pressure gauge didn't stop at 44. It swung past 50, past 60. The needle buried itself in the red zone. The engines didn't hum, they shrieked. A gout of blue flame erupted from the exhaust stacks. The P-38 shuddered, not from weakness, but from raw, violent torque. It surged forward as if it had been kicked by a giant. Vance pulled back on the yoke. The heavy fighter went vertical. It climbed straight up, defying gravity, riding a column of supercharged air. The Zeros behind him stalled out, their engines gasping for air, unable to match the sudden, explosive vertical velocity. Vance looked down. He was thousands of feet above them in seconds. He was no longer the prey. When he landed, the engines were ticking and smoking, radiating heat like a blast furnace. The paint on the cowling was blistered. Mac was waiting on the wing before the props even stopped turning. Vance opened the canopy, his face pale but grinning like a madman. "Chief," Vance yelled over the dying whine of the turbos, "that stupid wire just saved my ass. She climbed like a homesick angel." Mac patted the hot aluminum skin of the engine. He looked at the corporal, who was staring at the plane in awe. "Burn the manual," Mac said softly. "We do it my way now."
August 1943. 20,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. Major Richard Bong was bored. He was flying Marge, his P-38 Lightning, on a routine fighter sweep. The sky was a brilliant, empty blue. Below, the jungle was a green carpet. But then the radio crackled. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! Break left!" Bong looked up and saw them. 5 Japanese Zeros were diving out of the sun. They were the elite of the Imperial Navy, veterans who had cut their teeth over China and the Philippines. They knew the P-38. They knew it was fast but clumsy. They knew that if they got on its tail in a turning fight, the American pilot was dead. Usually, Bong would have dived.
The standard doctrine was hit and run, dive away, use your speed to escape, and re-engage only when you had the advantage. But today was different. Today, Bong's crew chief had been busy with a pair of pliers and some safety wire. Bong saw the lead Zero commit to the attack. The Japanese pilot, confident in his superior maneuverability, banked hard to cut off Bong's escape route. He expected the P-38 to try a shallow dive or a wide, lumbering turn. Bong grinned behind his oxygen mask. "Let's see what she's got, old girl." He slammed the throttles forward to the stop. Normally, the P-38's heavy Allison engines would take a few agonizing seconds to spool up, the wastegates bleeding off precious pressure. But the wire held. The manifold pressure gauge didn't hesitate. It slammed past the red line, 60 inches of mercury and climbing. The engines didn't roar, they screamed. 3,200 horsepower hit the props instantly. Bong hauled back on the yoke. The P-38 didn't just climb, it leaped. The nose came up 40 degrees, then 60, then 90. The lightning went vertical. The G-forces crushed Bong into his seat, his vision graying at the edges, but the plane kept going up, powered by raw, unregulated boost. The Japanese pilot was stunned. He pulled back on his own stick, trying to follow the American up, but the Zero's lightweight Sakai engine, fed by a float-type carburetor, gasped. As he tried to match the vertical climb, his engine sputtered and cut out due to negative Gs. The Zero stalled, hanging in the air for a moment like a dead leaf. Bong was now thousands of feet above him. He kicked the rudder pedal over. At the apex of his climb, the P-38, heavy, powerful, and now terrifyingly agile in the vertical plane, flopped over onto its back. Bong pulled the nose down, gravity assisting the turn. He was now diving straight down at the stalled Zero. The impossible turn. The Japanese pilot looked up in horror. The American plane that was supposed to be running away was suddenly diving on him from above. 4 .5 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon blazing. Bong didn't even need to aim carefully. At this range, the sheer volume of fire was devastating. The Zero's wing root exploded, fuel ignited. The fragile fighter disintegrated in a ball of orange flame. Bong pulled out of the dive, the wire-tricked engines still screaming, and looked for the next target. The remaining 4 Zeros scattered. They had just witnessed the impossible. The fork-tailed devil had outclimbed them. It had outturned them in the vertical. The rules of engagement had changed in 10 seconds. Back at the base, Bong climbed down from the cockpit, his flight suit soaked in sweat. The crew chief was waiting, a worried look on his face as he inspected the scorched paint on the engine cowlings. "She hold together, Major?" Bong patted the nose of the plane. "She held together, Chief. And those Zeros, they never knew what hit 'em. They thought I was a bus. Turns out, I was a rocket." The word spread quickly. The wire trick wasn't just a mechanic's hack anymore. It was a weapon. The P-38 wasn't a clumsy giant. It was a vertical predator. And for the Japanese aces, the sky had just become a much more dangerous place.
By 1944, the Pacific sky belonged to the Lightning. The days of the paper kite terrorizing American squadrons were over. The P-38, once feared by its own pilots for its compressibility dives and sluggish turns, had transformed into the fork-tailed devil that the Japanese propaganda machine whispered about in hushed tones. The transformation wasn't just due to the engineers at Lockheed who finally installed dive flaps to cure the compressibility issues. It was due to the grease-stained mechanics on jungle airstrips who had used safety wire to bypass the regulators, unlocking the raw, screaming power of the Allison engines. It was due to men like Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who visited the Pacific as a civilian consultant, teaching pilots how to lean their fuel mixtures to impossible levels, extending the P-38's range from 400 miles to over 1,000. But the true legacy of the Lightning was written by two men, Major Richard Bong and Major Thomas McGuire. Dick Bong was a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like he should be driving a tractor. But in the cockpit of Marge, his silver P-38, he was a virtuoso. Bong understood what the wire trick gave him: verticality. He didn't dogfight the Zeros, he disintegrated them. He would dive from 30,000 feet, his engines howling with manifold pressure well past the factory red line, slash through a Japanese formation with his 450 cals and 20mm cannon, and then use that massive kinetic energy to zoom back up into the sun before the Japanese even knew he was there. Bong racked up 40 confirmed kills, becoming the American ace of aces. McGuire, his rival and friend, followed close behind with 38. They proved that a heavy twin-engine fighter could dominate the agile Japanese fleet if flown and maintained correctly. However, the defining moment of the Lightning's legacy, the mission that changed the course of the war, happened on April 18, 1943. U.S. Navy intelligence had cracked the Japanese codes. They knew that Admiral Irisoku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most brilliant strategist in the Imperial Navy, would be flying to Bougainville for an inspection tour. It was a suicide mission. The target was hundreds of miles deep in enemy territory. No single-engine fighter, not the Corsair, not the Hellcat, certainly not the P-40, had the range to get there and back. Only the Lightning could do it. 16 P-38s took off from Guadalcanal. They flew for 2.5 hours in total radio silence, skimming just 50 feet above the waves to avoid Japanese radar. It was a navigation miracle. If they were 1 minute early or late, they would miss the Admiral. At 9:35, right on schedule, the P-38s popped up over the jungle canopy of Bougainville. And there he was. 2 Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. The Japanese were stunned. They were in the middle of their own safe zone. They didn't believe American fighters could reach this far. They didn't know about the fuel mixture tricks. They didn't know about the mechanics who tuned the engines to run on fumes and prayers. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber banked their Lightnings hard. The Zeros tried to dive to protect their Admiral, but the P-38s were faster. The wired engines roared, delivering the burst of speed needed to close the gap. Barber shredded the right wing of the lead bomber. The Betty shuddered, rolled over, and crashed into the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto was dead. The P-38 had just decapitated the Imperial Japanese Navy. When the war ended, the P-38 Lightning had shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter in the Pacific theater. It had flown longer, fought higher, and hit harder than anything else in the sky. As the sun set on the Pacific War, the pilots who walked away from their battered twin-boom fighters knew the truth. They owed their lives not just to the armor plate behind their seats, but to the ingenuity of the ground crews. The mechanics who looked at a factory manual, saw the limits, and said, "To hell with that." They took a piece of safety wire and turned a heavy, misunderstood airplane into the ruler of the Pacific skies. The Lightning didn't just win battles, it broke the enemy's spirit. And that was its true legacy.